What if every crime, murder, theft, and corruption was suddenly untouchable by the law? This isn't some GTA-style glitch at a 5-star wanted level. It's a powerful legal shield that protects certain foreign officials from arrest, prosecution, and punishment. In theory, it keeps diplomacy running smoothly. In practice, it lets serious offenses slide without consequence. Today on the Infographic Show, we're breaking down how diplomatic immunity actually works and just how dangerously far it can go. Agreements on not arresting or killing diplomats date back to ancient times. Kings would send an envoy to another kingdom, sometimes a rival, with a shared understanding that no one would lose their head. Even when it wasn't written into the law, harming an envoy was seen as a dishonorable breach of trust. According to the historian Thucydides, Athens once executed Spartan envoys who came to negotiate peace in the 400s BC, an act widely viewed as a grave violation of protocol. The roots of modern diplomatic immunity trace back to the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815, a series of meetings among European powers after Napoleon's defeat. But it wasn't until 1961 that immunity was formally codified in international law at the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the foundation for the protections we know today. After that, pretty much all nations of the world towed the line, allowing foreign diplomats to serve out their missions without any interference. The treaty's goal was to solidify the development of friendly relations. There are rules, though. The host nation doesn't always have to play along, especially if the diplomat is really a covert CIA operative who thinks he's John Wick, spraying bullets through the streets and casually walking away from execution-style killings. That really happened. But first, let's take a look at the rule book. Under Article 9, if a host nation doesn't want a foreign diplomat on its soil, it can then declare them persona non grata. By law, the sending country must then recall the diplomat or end their mission within a reasonable time. If that request is refused, the host nation can simply stop recognizing that person as a diplomat. But while a diplomat is stationed there, the host nation isn't allowed to send police or agents into their residence to snoop around for documents, and they are definitely not allowed to take anything. Even if the diplomat is suspected of wrongdoing, their home is off limits unless both nations reach an agreement to override the international law. Diplomatic couriers must be allowed to deliver items or messages without interference. Anything sent in a bag, even a massive crate marked diplomatic, is completely off limits to authorities. And if a courier has been officially designated to deliver it, that person is also immune from arrest or detention. But that doesn't extend to your DoorDash driver. And we know what you're thinking. That means that diplomats could effectively traffic weapons or, if they're inclined, drugs. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill used to get his shipments of Cuban cigars in a diplomatic bag. Still, the rationale is that diplomats are not supposed to be illegal, so you leave their bags alone. Article 29 of the law is the important one, though. It states that diplomats should not be arrested or detained, or at least the host nation should do everything in its power to ensure that doesn't happen. They should be immune to civil and criminal charges in a court of law, as should their families, who are also protected under diplomatic immunity. So, if you've got an ambassador with a wayward teenage son, maybe a prolific weed smoker or a reckless driver of his sports car, he could cause all kinds of trouble and still be virtually untouchable by local law. And it happens more often than you might think. But for now, let's stick to the rules. Immunity doesn't mean the diplomat and his family have an absolutely impenetrable shield against all accountability. The law is to preserve the dignity of the protected persons, but that doesn't mean you can get involved with arms dealing and expect to flash a badge and then walk free like they do in the movies. Criminal immunity can only be waived if the diplomat's home country agrees. If that happens, the diplomat, their family, or even a spy can be charged and sentenced in court like anyone else. But some countries refuse to waive immunity even when their diplomat is in serious trouble, and diplomats themselves can't give it up. It's entirely up to their home country. So even though the diplomats definitely do not walk around with a get-out-of-jail-free card in their pocket, they still have a lot of cover. And even if they're charged, they often seem to receive sweetheart deals or soft treatment. In May 2002, a 21-year-old man was going about his business in West London when he was approached by two men outside of a busy tube station. He spotted the glint of a knife and was forced to hand over the PIN to his bank card. Shaken and scared, he rushed home to his suburban London house and told his father what had just happened. And the father was furious. But he wasn't just any father. He was Sergeant Major Jairo Soto Mendoza of the Colombian Security Services, a Special Forces veteran who had seen more than his share of violence back home. He wasn't the kind of man that you wanted to cross unless you had a death wish. Soto Mendoza and his son hit the streets to hunt down the muggers, and they soon found them in a shop near the scene. The robbers bolted and Soto Mendoza gave chase. What happened next is unclear, but it ended with a knife in the chest of one of the muggers, Damian Broome. He later died from his injuries in the hospital. The BBC reported shortly after, Diplomat killed mugger in anger, and according to the prosecutor, the stabbing was a deliberate thrust intended to cause serious harm. Police wasted no time in arresting Mr. Soto Mendoza, charging him with murder. The problem was that he was a military attaché to the Colombian embassy in London, so he had diplomatic immunity under international law. The only way the case could go to trial was if the Colombian government agreed to lift the waiver. The Telegraph newspaper wrote, "Unless Colombia withdraws their diplomatic status, the strongest action British authorities can take is to deport them." But Colombia agreed to the waiver, and the trial went ahead, and it quickly became an international incident. Britain's leader at the time, Tony Blair, got involved, reportedly raising the issue with the Colombian president-elect Alvaro Uribe. Sending a diplomat to prison is a very serious business that could affect economic and political relations. You might assume Colombia's biggest export to the UK is cocaine, but in reality, the two nations do far more business in energy, environmental projects, and financial services. So it's no surprise that the next time the British press mentioned Soto Mendoza, it was to report him weeping in court as he was cleared of murder and already planning his flight back to Colombia. News reports said the prosecutor couldn't convince the jury that Soto Mendoza had intentionally killed Broome. Soto Mendoza admitted that he'd relied on his special forces training, insisting that in the struggle, Broome's knife ended up in his own chest, purely by accident. You know, just one of those things that can happen in a fight. The diplomatic shield, supposedly lifted, almost certainly influenced the outcome. That's what Broome's stepmother believed, telling reporters this man is walking away because of diplomatic immunity. People can't go around killing other people's kids. Maybe not in the real world, but this wasn't the real world. Mr. Broome's family had gotten an introduction to just how the world actually works for the powerful. But as this next murky tale tells us, not all diplomats can get away with murder. Back in 1997, Gheorghe Macaradza left a well-known Greek taverna in Washington, D.C. He and a group of suited colleagues had spent the night eating and drinking a considerable amount of alcohol. Macaradza stumbled into his expensive car and sped off through the heart of the nation's capital. When the police tried to pull him over, he refused, sparking a high-speed chase. He eventually lost control and slammed into another vehicle, triggering a 5-car pileup that killed a 16-year-old girl and left 3 others injured. In the U.S., this is a serious crime that can lead to a murder conviction and a long prison sentence. But this wasn't just any person. 35-year-old Macaradza was the second highest-ranking diplomat in the Georgian embassy in D.C. He couldn't be prosecuted because he had the cover of the diplomatic shield. The State Department had to get involved, which meant talking to the Georgian government about waiving immunity. Macaradza was a big deal. He had made headlines years earlier when he defected from the Soviet Union to the U.S., after which the U.S. refused to extradite him. But despite him being something of a Cold War hero, he was sentenced to 7 to 21 years in prison for manslaughter. Still, given the severity of the crash and the fact that D.C. is notoriously tough on these cases, Macaradza was lucky to avoid a second-degree murder conviction. If an ordinary person had done the exact same thing with the same outcome, they would almost certainly have been facing 15 years to life. Macaradza would be out in 3 years, and he would serve just another 2 back in Georgia. But the fact that he got some prison time was seen as justice. Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Winfrey said the sentence sent a message that diplomatic immunity is a shield and not a sword. She was making the point that diplomats couldn't get away with killing people, which is what the public might think usually happens. Take the case of Harry Dunn. In 2019, he was traveling on his motorcycle down a quiet rural road in England when a car struck him head-on. He later died from his injuries. Investigators soon revealed the driver had been on the wrong side of the road. Dunn was just 19 years old and he never stood a chance. For a regular person in Britain, this would have likely been a case of death caused by dangerous driving, carrying a long prison sentence. But that didn't apply to Anne Sacoolas, an American tied to one of the many agencies within the United States intelligence community. The reason that she was in England was that she had been stationed near a listening post, the kind of facility built to intercept conversations where her CIA husband was working. And to make matters worse, Sacoolas already had a history of reckless driving. Back in the US, she'd been in trouble with the police for failing to pay full time and attention while driving. The Dunn's family lawyer later discovered that on the very day of the crash, Sacoolas' usually active phone had been wiped clean of data. While it's unclear if she ever called the police, Sacoolas did cooperate with them, though at the time it wasn't certain whether she had actually had diplomatic immunity. A British Foreign Office diplomat even texted a U.S. official saying, "It's obviously not us approving their departure, but I think you should feel able to put them on the next flight out." It looked a lot like bending the rules. With the aid of U.S. intelligence officers in the UK, she fled the country on a private plane before any requests were made for her immunity to be waived, if she even had immunity. You don't usually get immunity just because your spouse works at a British spy station. Lawyers told the Dunn family that Mrs. Sacoolas wasn't covered. Her husband's name wasn't even on the official list of diplomats, which meant effectively she was now a fugitive. The Dunn family flew to the U.S. to fight for justice, but of course justice wasn't served. It was reported that President Trump gave permission for officials to offer the family compensation and that the U.S. was ready to write a check, but the Dunns turned it down. The media later reported that Sacoolas' CIA ties and the UK's so-called special relationship with Washington virtually guaranteed the case was swept under an already bulging diplomatic rug. The family pushed for her extradition. Sacoolas had been charged with causing death by dangerous driving, a crime that carries up to 14 years in prison. But instead, she was tried in absentia, convicted of a lesser offense, and handed an 8-month suspended sentence, along with a 1-year driving ban. It meant little since she remained safely in the U.S. As for her supposed immunity, London and Washington pointed to a vague legal loophole. Critics argued they were simply making it up as they went along. That loophole, if it ever existed, was quietly closed. It was later reported in the media that American officials are involved in road accidents in the UK all the time, and sometimes they fly the coop. That said, in 2023, when an American tied to the Secret Service hit a nurse and left her seriously injured, the story played out very differently. He skipped his court date, but the U.S. sent him back, where he served 32 months in prison. In 2024, the UK press reported that the Foreign Office admitted diplomats and their families had gone on what it called an orgy of crime in 2023. This ranged from sexual misconduct and public indecency to child cruelty and even storing indecent images on hard drives. There were 9 cases of serious offenses. The countries involved included Portugal, Iraq, Ghana, Libya, and Mongolia, and not a single person was convicted. And remember, this is out of the roughly 26,500 people in the UK entitled to diplomatic or international organization immunity. But diplomats pushed their luck all over the world. In Germany in 2025, it was reported that diplomats from various countries often drove their diplomatic cars like the rules of the road didn't exist. German police issued thousands of tickets, to which the diplomats just pulled out their immunity card. There were 18,000 road violations in total, but only 2,500 diplomatic cars, so an average of 7 violations for every car. Saudi Arabia was the worst offender, followed by the US, with Iraq in 3rd place. Italy, Ukraine, and Egypt were featured high on the list. In 2023, it all amounted to almost 379,000 euros in traffic-related fines, none of which were paid. And we're not just talking about speeding or failing to signal. In 2024, diplomats' cars in Germany were involved in 48 incidents, leaving 19 people injured, 1 seriously, and 1 dead. In 28 cases, the drivers fled the scene, which in itself is usually grounds for sending someone to prison for 3 years. Then you have the people doing all of the cleaning at the consulates and the embassies, the domestic staff. Because their employers operate in a legal gray area, abuse is all too common. News reports are full of cases where workers say they were mistreated, underpaid, and even trafficked by diplomats. In 2023, 2 Filipino domestic workers filed a lawsuit against the Pakistani mission to the United States and Switzerland, alleging that they had been trafficked and denied their wages. And it apparently happened in the U.S. too. In 2017, domestic workers protested outside the German consulate in New York City, stating that they hadn't been paid their full wages. 2 people were working up to 11-hour shifts each day in a 6-bedroom, 6-bathroom home while taking care of 4 children. Despite the minimum wage in New York then being $12 to $13 an hour, they were paid $4 an hour. They sued, but their cases were dismissed because of diplomatic immunity. Human rights groups say this isn't unusual and that diplomats all over the world exploit the system, knowing exactly how to bend the rules. Now let's talk about when things go really wrong. If you want a story drenched in blood, look no further than Raymond Davis, a U.S. Army veteran turned CIA contractor operating undercover in Pakistan. In 2011, Davis opened fire through the car windshield in Lahore, Pakistan's 2nd largest city, killing 2 men on the spot. Moments later, a Toyota Land Cruiser sped the wrong way through the traffic to extract him, running over and killing a third man, an innocent bystander crushed beneath its wheels. Davis tried to escape but was intercepted and taken into custody. He claimed the men on the bikes had tried to rob him, but the evidence painted a very different picture. He had been driving when the men had pulled up on motorbikes in front of his car at a red light. Davis then pointed his firearm at the windshield and fired, hitting both of them in the back. So it hardly looked like robbery. Pakistani authorities charged Davis with murder, but President Obama intervened, insisting Davis was protected as an administrative and technical official attached to the U.S. consulate in Lahore. In other words, he had diplomatic immunity. But did diplomatic immunity cover daylight executions and that unfortunate but deadly accident? Pakistani prosecutors argued that even if Davis had been targeted in a robbery, his response was extreme. He fired 10 shots at the men, then stepped out of his car and calmly took photos of the wounded with his phone. Reports also claimed that he fired 4 more rounds into the men as they lay dead on the ground. President Obama said there was no way he was going to waive immunity for an American. Chief diplomatic troubleshooter, Senator John Kerry, went to Pakistan to try to smooth things over, but when he returned to the U.S., it was by himself. If something didn't change, it was looking like the U.S. Embassy in Pakistan was going to be the scene of mass protests, even bloodshed. The Pakistani people said it wasn't right that some American could shoot up the streets and get away with it. Pakistani officials later confirmed that both Davis and the reckless getaway driver were CIA. Then came the announcement, they have flown the coop, they are already in America. The U.S. came back and said it was against international treaties that the men were detained at all. They had immunity. No waivers had been issued. Pakistan had no right to even enter their houses. But given Davis's background, his special forces work, and his place at the mysterious firm Blackwater, Washington didn't push any further. Lawyers in Pakistan argued that this wasn't the work of a spy. It was espionage, plain and simple. And then the plot thickened. It later emerged that the 2 men Davis shot were likely working for Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence Agency and may have been warning him to back off of his surveillance work. At least that is one theory. But Davis hadn't flown the coop at all. He was still in Pakistan, where it seems some officials believed the U.S. was planning to bust him out of jail in a Hollywood-style sting. So, were the families of the dead ever going to see justice? Of course not, or at least that depends on how you define justice. In the end, the U.S. paid $2.4 million in blood money to the families, and then the judge dismissed the murder charge. By then, Davis was likely stretched out in first class watching a Sandra Bullock movie. Why Davis went on this bloody rampage remains a mystery. Like many so-called victims, he later wrote a book about it, but it was likely shaped and censored by the U.S. government, so we probably could take that with a heavy pinch of salt. And while diplomats might get away with almost anything, wait until you hear what spies have pulled off. Check out 50 insane facts about the CIA you never knew, or click on this video instead.